Only last week I was contacted by a friend that I haven't seen in 20 years. Her and I had been neighbors and best friends until something crazy happened and we lost contact. And the following will be my best possible retelling of the incident that separated us, so please be patient. I was only 10 at the time, and anyone older who may know more is no longer around for me to even ask. But anyhow, I grew up in a very poor area in small-town Missouri. The house we rented was barely better than a shack. The entire area was just above trailer park level, if you get my meaning, and both my parents worked at least 2 jobs, and I was left alone with no one to really talk to. And that's why I was so excited when Julie and her family finally moved in next door. I walked around outside until she noticed me and asked if she wanted to be my friend. She agreed and we began spending all of our time together. It didn't take long before I noticed something odd was happening, though. Julie's parents were very nice, but had a very strange way about them. Even my parents brought it up when they met them, and to start, they were very religious. While that wasn't out of the ordinary for our area, they spent more time studying the Bible than anyone I'd ever encountered. Not only was a large part of Julie's education about religion, but she was also required to take part in the family Bible study every evening at home. Julie's education was also odd to me. Unlike the other kids I knew, she was homeschooled by her mother. This was probably the strangest to me, as I'd never known that you could do it before I met her. Once she explained it to me, I took a liking to it and tried to convince my mom to teach me. She explained that we couldn't afford for her to stay home, but I was young and didn't understand, and I remained jealous for a long time, but after the truth was discovered and Julie went away, it didn't seem so neat anymore. I was just a couple of weeks away from my 11th birthday when Julie was taken away. Early on a Friday morning, I think, I was awakened for school and noticed some blue and red lights flashing through my curtains. I looked out and saw a bunch of police cars next door at Julie's. When I asked my parents what was happening, they just told me not to worry about it. After breakfast, I was dropped off at school like normal, but I couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was Julie. And without any information, my young mind went wild with possibilities, and many of them very awful. I was far too excited to wait for the bus. Instead, I ran the mile or so home. I went straight to Julie's, and I pounded on the door for at least 5 minutes, but I never got an answer. And this just made me more nervous. By the time my mom had made it home, I was throwing up and crying. It took her almost half an hour to calm me down. Although I didn't understand everything she told me, I knew that I'd never see my friend again. Once I was calm enough to listen, my mother sat me down and told me what had happened. Most of what I know was now pieced together after the fact, but I'm pretty sure Mom already had the basics by that afternoon. She had returned home after dropping me off at school. She found an officer and asked what was happening. The officer asked her to wait for him to come back. A moment later, an FBI agent approached her and asked if she could answer some questions about the family. She agreed, and they walked next door to our house to do the interview. After a few basic questions, the agent told Mom the story. Julie had been abducted from a Walmart store in Oklahoma when she was just 4. He and the agency had been searching for her since it happened, but her abductors were always a step ahead. He didn't say how they'd finally tracked them down, but I assumed they made a mistake and that was all they needed to find this couple. And by the time school had ended, Julie was long gone. More of the story got back to us over the next few years. My dad came across a newspaper article from Julie's hometown that included many of the details that we were not yet aware of. It began by telling how Julie had been abducted from the store when her mother wasn't paying attention. Then it went on to discuss the search and 6-year investigation to find her. Possibly the most interesting part of the article covered the motives behind the abduction. The male of the couple discussed how they had lost a daughter around Julie's age in a hit-and-run the year prior. His wife became so inconsolable that he feared that she would take her life. In a very misguided attempt at preventing that, he noticed a little girl all by herself on a Walmart toy aisle and took her. Since then, he and his wife had raised Julie as their own, doing their best to ensure that she felt loved and always wanted. They both admitted they knew it was wrong, but claimed that they'd allowed their grief to drive them to make a poor decision. As I said at the start, it's been 20 years since Julie returned to her family. I never expected to see or hear from her again. That's why I was so shocked and pleased when I got her message. We're currently trying to find an open space in both of our schedules so we can meet and catch up. I haven't looked forward to something like this since my son was born. If she's interested in sharing her life in the intervening years, I'll be sure to share it with you, and I can't imagine it's a boring tale to tell. I'd like to wrap this up with a very appropriate message for all you parents out there. It's really more of a reminder, I guess. Always keep your children in sight. I know little ones are good at disappearing in the blink of an eye, but evil often lurks around every corner. It only takes a short lapse in concentration for your world to change forever. I never realized how important my grandmother was to me until she was gone. Our family lived in a different state, and I didn't get to see her as much as I would have liked. On the big holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving, she would fly in and stay with us. This was our only time to really sit and discuss things. She was the only person in my family who knew its history and where we came from. I did all I could during these visits to get the whole story, but something always got in the way. And when she passed away in 2015, I thought that was the end. So many people would be forgotten, but I was sure Dad's mom wouldn't be one of them. I'd heard and recorded countless stories of her upbringing and thought that I knew everything there was to know about her. And that was until 2021, and a terrible storm came along that left us all stuck inside with nothing to do. One cold winter night, I would hear something about my grandmother that she had never told me. This would not only be a massive shock, but would change the way that I viewed her forever. So this story happened in February of 2021. A massive freeze struck Texas and left most of the state stuck inside without power. I fled from my apartment to my parents' house soon after the power cuts began, and they had purchased 50 acres outside town when I was 12 and built a house on it. My dad had a few heaters set up around the house connected to a generator, and these kept us warm and allowed us to avoid the burst pipes problem a lot of others were having. Although powerful, the generator wasn't strong enough to run anything else like TVs or computers at the same time. We had plenty of work to do during the day, but the evenings were very boring. By the second night, everyone was sick of board games. It was the third evening in which Dad would tell us a story very few of us were even aware of. We spent that third day much like the others. After the animals were fed, Dave drove around to his neighbors and checked on them. He assisted where he could. When he returned, we laid down more sand and gravel on the walkways. It was nearly dark when we finished. After a relaxing dinner lit by oil lamps and candles, we discussed the entertainment for the evening. My mom wasn't interested in blackjack, so she just curled up with a book while Dad and I played. An hour or so passed before we grew sick of the cards and decided to tell some scary stories instead. And this soon devolved into tales of my parents' childhoods and all the trouble they got into. I made a comment about my dad's mom being mad, and that's when he mentioned her not having any room to talk. This got my attention. I pushed him on this, and he tried to change the subject. My curiosity had been aroused, and I wasn't about to just let this go. I pushed him a bit more, and he seemed to finally cave. So the following is more or less what he recalled, although not word for word. I'm sure you'll get the gist of what I'm saying. I'm pretty sure the year was 1968. Mom was born and raised in a small town, Indiana. Her dad was a preacher and farmed a plot of a few hundred acres that he'd inherited. From what I'd heard, he was a hard man to love. His literal interpretation of Bible scriptures led to sometimes pretty severe punishment. Mom said it was a constant struggle for approval. Despite this, she loved her father with all of her heart and did all he demanded. That was until she met Daryl Mitchell. She was 16 when she saw him at the drugstore, and it was all downhill after that. Daryl was about 20 and no stranger to the law. He was what everyone used to call a hoodlum. He didn't know Mom, but something drew him to her. The second he introduced himself, Mom couldn't think of anything else. They were soon head over heels in love, and there was no way that it could end well after that. It wouldn't be long before the news of their romance got back to Mom's folks, and to say that they were horrified is a giant understatement. Daryl's criminal history was common knowledge around town, and most of those who knew Mom personally were shocked at her choice of boyfriends. And in hindsight, it wasn't anything new. Thousands of young girls lose their hearts to bad boys every year. Her parents' reaction was no surprise either. Mom was ordered to end the relationship and never see Daryl again. It was a heartbreaking decision, but at her core, Mom was an obedient daughter and did as her daddy demanded. After a short, tear-soaked phone call, the whirlwind romance appeared to be all but over, but what no one knew at the time, one or both participants had no intention of letting it end so easily. To those watching from the outside, the relationship looked like it was over. However, behind the scenes, Mom and Daryl were still seeing each other secretly. A crazy and stupid plan was being hatched that would assure that the pair could be together forever without unwanted intrusion from the grown-ups around them, and when the time was right, the couple set the scheme into motion. Mom left for school as usual, but Daryl picked her up a few blocks from home. They hit the road from there, confident that they would be halfway across the country before anyone even noticed Mom was missing. The plan may have worked had Mom not been a good student. When she didn't arrive for her first 2 classes, the school called home to ask if she was sick. Her mother called her dad immediately, and the search began. After a substantial amount of pressure was put on her friends, one of them broke down and told the police about their pair's plan to escape, and a statewide alert was put out for them, but they had already passed into Illinois. Although their destination was unknown, the authorities had a strong suspicion Mom and Daryl were heading up to Canada. Once alerts were sent out to the states along their path, all anyone could do was wait. The following day, the cops in Indiana got a call from Illinois, and the news wasn't good. Earlier that morning, a highway patrolman caught sight of Daryl's car and attempted to pull them over. Daryl offered no resistance at first, but opened fire on the patrolman as he approached the vehicle. Unfortunately, the patrolman was killed, and the couple fled the scene. Less than an hour later, several more patrolmen caught up with the car and a chase began, and the chase went a few miles before Daryl crashed into a ditch. At that point, he tried to shoot it out with the police, but was actually killed in the firefight. Mom was only a bit scratched up from the crash and had a grazing wound on her forehead, but was uninjured otherwise. After a quick examination at the hospital, she was arrested and taken into custody, and what was supposed to be a romantic escape had just become her worst nightmare. The man that she loved was now dead, and she was facing the death penalty for killing a cop. Luckily for her, society still viewed females as powerless against these men, and she did the smart thing and swore that she had been taken against her will. There was a small group who knew the truth, but they stayed silent, and in the end, Mom was let off with a short term of probation and allowed to return home. As it is in small towns, tongues were constantly wagging about her, but she toughed it out long enough to finish high school. Not long after graduation, she found a job in Dallas and moved there, and with a new city, she was able to start a new life. Nobody knew her history, and that's the way she liked it. Eventually, she met my dad, and they were married. I have no idea when he found out about her little adventure, but I know he was aware of it. He didn't seem to care, though, but then again, I have my suspicions that Dad had a history of his own as well. I didn't personally find out about this until I was already in my 20s. It came as quite a shock at first, but that faded pretty quickly. I can't recall any of us ever discussing it again. It's a strange story when you know my mom, but we all have a past. And that's where he left it. I was dumbstruck, and my grandmother had never done as much as use a curse word in my presence, and now I was finding out that she played a part in a murder. Dad was right, though. We all have a history, a past, and his mom's just happened to be way more extreme than most. That's probably the strangest part about all of this. I'd always had this view of my grandmother as this cookie-cutter, stereotypical, old, nice woman. That's not a bad thing to be honest. It's just kind of boring, but now that I know about Daryl, my perception had completely changed. I see their love as both terrifying and romantic. I doubt she ever imagined things would turn out the way they did. She probably thought that she could change him. They'd get away to Canada and just live happily ever after. That fantasy was destroyed in a hail of bullets. Losing someone she loved so much had to have been difficult. She could have just given up then and there, but she didn't, and instead, she picked herself up and started over somewhere else. That mistake could have destroyed her whole future, but she didn't let it, and for that, I'll always respect her so much more. Before I get to the point of this, I figured that it would help if I gave some background to my life. Currently, I'm an 18-year-old male living in Missouri. Ever since my father left when I was 5, I've been very aware of my role in our family. Despite my young age, I knew what being man of the house meant. I did all I could to protect my mother and sister from the outside world, no matter the consequences. Even though I knew a bad beating was coming my way, I stood up to a much older kid when he called my sisters some profane names. I may not have known what that meant exactly at the time, but my sister's tears told me that it was a bad name, and it ultimately cost me a tooth, but every kid in our town learned just how determined I was after that fight. It was by no means the last beating that I would receive at the hands of another kid for defending my family. I rarely won fights, but I'll never be sorry that I protected them. I'd do it all again tomorrow if I had to, even if it cost my life. Fighting wasn't the only aspect of keeping my family safe. Probably the worst event in my life was when my sister was killed in a hit and run. She was only 16 when it happened, and her death almost destroyed our mom. Despite barely being 13 myself, I stepped forward to take some of the weight off of her shoulders. When it became clear that we didn't have enough money to give my sister a decent funeral, I sold everything I owned except my clothes. I only kept my clothes because I didn't think anyone would want threadbare hand-me-downs from Goodwill. In the end, it wasn't enough. Fortunately, my dad's family were kind enough to pay, and regardless, I still gave the money to my mom to help with bills. I only wish that I could have given her more, but nobody would hire me because of my age. I say this all simply to show how important family has always been in my life, and maybe now you understand why a secret from the past has left me so confused and needing help. When I was given the assignment early in the semester, I had no idea what I was about to expose. Because of my grades for my junior year, I was placed in AP Biology for my senior year. In truth, the assignment to trace our family trees didn't really have much to do with genetics. I think the teacher really wanted us to see just how complex the human family really is. I looked forward to learning about my family's past, but felt resistance almost from the beginning. When I first mentioned the assignment, my mom quickly changed the subject. I didn't think anything of it then, but every mention of it after that was treated the same way or just completely ignored. I wasn't sure what lay behind her reaction, but it was clear that she had something to hide. And just my luck, I came across a distant cousin on a genealogy site, and she was able to give me most of what I needed. All I was lacking was a small amount that only my mom could provide. As my deadline grew closer, I became more nervous and begged her to help. She continued coming up with excuses and stalled until I mentioned the cousin. The sort of sick look spread across her face, and she asked me to just sit down. I never could have guessed what I was about to hear, though. Until the 1990s, my family had been relatively normal. Mom's side had arrived in the United States in the mid-1800s. They arrived from Sweden, like thousands of others, and purchased a small piece of land to farm. My grandparents met after World War II and started a family. When one of my uncles passed, my mom and her twin brother were the only remaining children. Everything was normal until my mom was about 13. Around then, her father began visiting her bedroom late at night. That's as far as I'll go with that. She kept this quiet for a little while in hopes that it would stop, but after a year passed and it continued, she confessed it to her mother. Rather than get angry at her husband, my grandmother called my mom a liar and even slapped her. She kept it to herself after that. The bedroom visits would carry on until someone noticed and ended it. That person would be my uncle, my mom's twin brother. He had been unaware of all of this until he happened to see his dad coming out of mom's room one night. He ignored it at the time, thinking that it was nothing, but when he confronted his sister, she broke down and confessed everything. Naturally, he was disgusted and angry about what he just heard and asked his father if it was true. Instead of denying it outright, his dad told him to mind his own business, and this just made him more furious. In a matter of moments, everything changed forever. Mom's brother left the room he and his father had been speaking in and took a shotgun from his closet. He returned to find his father sitting on the couch watching television. The boy calmly and quietly walked up behind his father and shot him in the back of the head. That clearly was all it took. One up-close blast from the powerful weapon and it was all over. As you can imagine, the home flew into chaos. My uncle put up no resistance as the police took him away, and this would be the last time Mom would ever see her twin. What should have ended there just got worse. My grandmother constantly cursed my mom, blaming her for her husband's death. The abuse got so bad that Mom finally ran away from home with my dad and got married. You already know how that ended. I was left speechless after hearing this. I had no idea what to say. Her story had answered so many questions, yet so many more were created at the same time. I had already wondered why Mom's side of the family never came around. I just assumed that they were all dead. Mom never once mentioned them, and if anybody from that side of the family came up in conversation, Mom would just ignore it. Dad must have known, considering that he never brought them up, and I realize now how odd that is. My friends would ask about that part of the family, and I couldn't do any more than just shrug. When you're young, stuff like that doesn't matter. Now it's the only thing that does. Since the day she told me, we haven't said much to each other. I can't speak for Mom, but I have no clue what I would say if we did. There's so many thoughts and questions swirling around my head, I can't think of anything else. Although I have nothing but sympathy for my mom and the horror she was forced to experience, I'm left wondering how many other things I've been lied to about. A small part of me hates her for keeping it from me, but that's just my selfish side coming through. Despite my paper being just days away from being due, I could care less about it. I don't even care whether I graduate or not at this point. Obviously, I'm keeping things anonymous here from sending this in, but maybe somebody out there can help me. But as things stand, I can't imagine how. I was 12 when I met my best friend. Now, for privacy and legal reasons, we'll just call him Kyle. This year was 2006, and my dad was transferred to a new city for his job. I met Kyle on my first day of school. I was sitting in the office while my mom spoke to the principal, and Kyle had just gotten into a fight and been sent to the office to be punished. He still had blood running out of his nose, I remember. We began talking, and before I knew it, I had made my first friend. Our houses were only about a mile apart, and I'd ride my bike over to his place all the time. From my perspective, his home life was awesome. Both of his parents were professors at the university and had a very liberal stance on parenting. Kyle and his brother were left to raise themselves for the most part, and we took advantage of it. My best memories of my childhood took place at Kyle's house. I would have spent all my time there, but I'm not sure Kyle would have the same opinion. No matter how free he may have appeared, his life was closer to a prison in one major aspect. Not long after I met him, I noticed Kyle showed up at school with black eyes and bruises all over him. I assumed that these were caused from frequent fights or something. I know that's what the teachers thought because they said as much. However, I would soon come to realize that this wasn't the case the better I got to know him. Maybe the second time I was at his house, I witnessed his brother push him down and laugh. This was just the first of many times I'd see him being abused by his older sibling. I'm well aware that brothers and sisters fight sometimes, but this wasn't that though. Casey, Kyle's older brother, would often just attack him out of nowhere with no provocation. It was sad to see, but what was even worse was how his parents reacted to it. Every time he asked them for help, they just blew him off. He was told that boys will be boys and was sent on his way. There were so many times someone could have stopped this, but nobody seemed to care enough. I'm not a psychologist, but I think the abuse from his brother is what drove him to get into fights at school. I can only assume that it was an attempt to regain some amount of power that had been robbed from him at home. He would usually pick the biggest kid that he could find. Whether he won or lost, I never saw him walk away without a smile. It was like he had some split personality, and this side just came out to fight. A few minutes would pass, and his normal quiet and kind side re-emerged to take over again. I witnessed him get into probably 10 fights. Each one he cursed and mocked his opponent into a raging fury, but not once in all the years I've known him did he ever raise his voice to me. Had I not seen this side of him, I wouldn't believe it even existed. To this day, I've never met another person like him. He'll always be like family to me, but deep down, I'll always be terrified of that beast that lurked just below the surface, ready to strike seemingly at any moment. As the years went by, a lot of things changed, but Kyle's home situation stayed the same. The abuse continued to escalate until Kyle ended up in the hospital a few times, and each time his brother would ease up, but like an abusive spouse, something set him off and he'd lose control again. Just in time, some ray of hope appeared the year when we turned 15. Casey had graduated the year previously and left for college, and Kyle was finally free, and his attitude began to show it. The fight stopped almost completely, and he was smiling a lot more. His grades even started to improve so much that he made the honor roll for the first time in his life. As we headed into the Christmas break, life couldn't have been better. And then, all of a sudden, it all fell apart. On the 27th of December, I got a phone call from Kyle I'll never forget. The day prior, Casey had come home after drinking and fell down the stairs, and at present he was in a coma. The doctors weren't sure if he would even wake up, and if he did, he'd probably have severe brain damage for the rest of his life. And despite the long history of abuse, Kyle was shattered over the event. And against all odds, Casey did survive, but the doctor's prognosis proved correct. The fall had done severe neurological damage, and he was left confined to a wheelchair and unable to communicate. He remains dependent on others for everything to this day, and Kyle changed too. Although he managed to get on with his life, a cloud seemed to hover over him from then on. I would slowly see less and less of him until I graduated and moved away to attend college as well. Other than the occasional phone call, we had very little contact with one another for the next few years. I would eventually get a degree and move again for work, and by this time, Kyle and I had lost contact completely, but I had no idea how to reach him. And it wouldn't be until I was 25 years old and starting my own family that he would make a brief reappearance before disappearing again, but this time, forever. One year during Christmas, my wife and I took our newborn daughter to meet her grandparents for the first time. We were all sitting around the table catching up when the phone rang. My mom answered and told the caller to hold on for a moment. Kyle wanted to talk, and she asked if I wanted to speak to him. I did, and of course, took the phone into the other room. We made small talk for a few moments before he invited me out to get some drinks. I agreed, and we met up at a bar downtown. We spent an hour there before we left for his house, grabbing a 12-pack on the way. And it was just like the old days, hanging out in that giant house, just the two of us. His parents had given him the old place when they divorced, and Casey had been put in a rest home long ago. We just so happened to be sitting on that same staircase that Casey plunged down when Kyle made a terrible confession. We were both pretty drunk when he said it, but the effect was no less shocking. The subject of Casey's accident came up when he confessed. "Come on, man, you don't have to play that game. You know I pushed him." It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and I choked on the beer that I was drinking. I paused and waited for him to say that he was joking, but he never did. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was serious. I tried to laugh it off, but he doubled down and went so far as to explain his reasons. He made it clear that it hadn't been premeditated. It just happened in the heat of the moment, and once Casey moved away, he was able to relax for the first time in his life. But then he visited for Christmas and all that pain came rushing back. He did his best to avoid him while he was there, but Casey sought him out and Kyle fought back for the first time in his life. They were at the top of the stairs and Kyle tried to push him away. Unfortunately for Casey, he was drunk. He lost his balance and fell. As usual, nobody was around to witness it. Kyle was scared and kept the truth to himself. Some people may have been suspicious at the time, but they never said anything, and I, for one, was not among them. I never suspected Kyle for a second. I had no clue what to say after this, and the conversation kind of just moved on to other subjects. Nonetheless, his confession floated around in my head for the rest of the night. I headed home around 3 a.m. and slept late the next day. For most of the afternoon, I assumed that I dreamed the whole thing up, but then Kyle sent me a text that proved that I hadn't. The text said, "I didn't mean to put you in this position. I'm sorry and understand if you don't want to hang out anymore. Do I have something to worry about?" It took me the rest of the day to decide what I was going to do. Even though I don't think Kyle meant to hurt his brother, a young man's life was ruined forever that night. I wouldn't wish that kind of hell onto anyone. And shortly before going to bed that night, I wrote him a text message that would be our last point of contact forever. It said, "You don't have anything to worry about from me, man. That said, I think it would be best if we didn't talk again. You need to get help with your anger issues before you kill someone. I hope you understand. You'll always be my brother." I kept my word and told no one about our conversation for the last 4 years, but now that I've been informed of Kyle's passing, I suppose it's time everyone knows the truth. I didn't ask how or why. It doesn't matter anyway. I just wish that I could have gotten to say goodbye one more time. I'll begin this by stating that I'm a 37-year-old male who owns his own business in the southern United States. My fiancée and I were introduced to each other by a mutual friend in our church. She and I have been together for about 2 years and recently decided to get married. Our relationship was great from the beginning, and I look forward to growing old with her, an idea that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. After a failed marriage in my early 20s, I never intended to ever get married again, but as the saying goes, never say never. I've been honest with her about almost everything during that period of my life. She knows my drinking problem was the main reason for the marriage's failure, but that's as far as I went. I haven't had a drop of alcohol in over 12 years and hopefully never will. Liquor came very close to ruining my life forever. And this brings me to the reason for sending this in. As I said, I've been honest about almost everything in my past. There is, however, one major incident that I haven't told her about. I'm afraid when I do, it will undo everything we built together, and I guess I'm just looking for advice from your audience. I'm very open about my alcoholism. It was part of my life, and I see no reason to hide it. I've worked very hard and continue to work daily to ensure that I never return to my past behavior. It was a normal part of my life for a long time and very nearly killed me. I was 15 when I started sneaking that occasional drink from my parents' liquor cabinet. The forbidden nature of it gave me an indescribable rush. My parents were too absorbed in their own lives to really notice what was happening, and I would eventually befriend an older man who would buy me my own bottles that I hid in my room. This is the point at which I truly became an alcoholic. I quickly learned to pace myself, but I was a drunk nonetheless, carrying a bottle of OJ and vodka everywhere I went. It took many years before any problems began to show themselves, and I was 20 when I had my first car accident. This would be why my parents first learned about my drinking. Fortunately, it was just a single car wreck and no one was injured, and since I had no record, I was just given probation and sent on my way. A smart person would have counted themselves lucky and stopped drinking, or at least stopped driving while drunk. I'm not that person. Less than a year later, I crashed into a parked car near my house. The judge was less understanding this time. He not only extended my probation to 10 years, but he also ordered me to get one of those breathalyzer things that connected to my ignition, and now my car wouldn't even start until I blew sober. Being the drunk bum that I was, I got around this by driving my now wife's car instead. I managed to make it over 3 years before I had my last and worst wreck. This would be the one that changed everything and the reason I'm writing this today. You see, at the time, I was 24 and working for a friend's business. On this night, I had been partying with some buddies at one of their houses, and he was reluctant to let me drive home, but by now, I was good at hiding how drunk I was, and I convinced him that I was okay. I didn't exactly have the smartest friends back then, and the truth is, I was trashed. All I remember is entering onto the highway, and everything after that is a blur, but according to the police report, I passed out at the wheel and crashed into another driver head-on. I wouldn't be as fortunate as I had been in the past. The other driver was a 22-year-old mother, and her 19-month-old child was in the car with her. Neither would survive the wreck, while I got away relatively unscathed. Of course, I was too drunk to know what was going on, and it wasn't until the next morning when I sobered up that I realized I was now a double murderer. If I could have taken my own life at that moment, I would have. Sitting in that jail cell, I promised God that I'd never take another drink again, and I've held that until today. The justice system was done giving me another chance. When the prosecutor offered me 9 years, I took it. I knew it was more than fair. I could have easily been sentenced to double that if I went to trial, and what followed was 6 years of the best and worst years of my life. I was lucky enough to have access to the last few remaining rehab programs that existed in the prison system. I spent every available moment trying to better myself, and it ultimately paid off. Don't get me wrong, though. Quitting drinking cold turkey was far from easy. There were moments that I came close to dying, and I would have deserved it. I took a few beatings, and my wife divorced me. Still, I didn't give up. I did all I could to stay out of trouble during my term inside, and I was granted early release after serving 6 years. The remainder of my sentence was spent on parole, which I completed 3 years later. My life since then had been a constant struggle, but one I fully embrace. Every day above the ground is a gift, I think. Please excuse this long-winded type-out, but there is a point to all of this, I promise. In the years since I've left prison, I've continued to attend AA meetings regularly and sponsors several other alcoholics. I've also become a member of a local church, which is where I was introduced to my now fiancée. And this brings us to my problem. At some point in the course of telling her about my life, I punked out and didn't tell her about the woman and infant that I killed. I'd already become emotionally invested in the relationship and was afraid that this would just scare her off. And now that we were planning to get married, I'm unsure what to do. Is it too late? Should I confess and pray that she doesn't walk out, or do I hope she never finds out and just keep my mouth shut? My conscience is pushing me to be honest, but I'm afraid it will destroy everything. I love her so much, and hiding this from her has been agonizing. And this is where I'm asking for guidance from strangers, people without any personal connection to either of us. So please, what should I do? There's no real way of sugarcoating it. I'm convinced my dad was murdered. I know it's a bold claim to make, but I've arrived at this conclusion only after a lot of hours of discussion and study, and this is the only way things really make sense. I've got a lot to cover, but I'll be as brief as possible. To start, my parents were high school sweethearts. When Dad was accepted to Penn State, Mom followed him, and upon graduation, they were married, and Dad took a job down in Florida. I would appear just a year later, and my sister the next year, and I really can't complain about my childhood. I had a lot of kids around me to play with and 2 parents who loved me. You'd have to ask my sister her opinion, but from my point of view, we had it a lot better than most of our friends. Life was going great until Mom got cancer. She went through chemo, and the cancer actually did go into remission, only to come back a few years later. This time she wasn't so lucky. Just before my graduation, she passed away at the age of 42. After the funeral, everyone picked themselves up and moved on the best they could. My sister and I soon moved away to college and left Dad at home with his thoughts. He was having a hard time until a friend suggested that he join a grief support group. The group turned out to be just what he needed. What we weren't expecting was that he'd fall in love there. Another member of the group, Laura, had lost her husband in a car accident. Her and Dad found comfort in one another and began dating. Less than a year later, Dad called to tell me he and Laura were getting married. Despite being a little shocked, I gave them my blessing, as did my sister. The wedding was beautiful, and seeing Dad able to smile again did a lot to lift me out of a hole of my own. It looked as if though everyone had made peace with Mom's death and were now able to focus on the future without her. Both my sister and I found our own long-term partners and were on the path of starting our own families as well. About 4 years went by in which I got married and my sister had her first child with her boyfriend. Life was improving for everyone except for Dad. You see, unknown to us, something was going on no one knew but Laura. Soon after the wedding, Dad and Laura bought this big new house on the lake. It was an amazing place but very expensive. Dad had to increase his hours at work to pay for it. Without Dad around to help her with the small chores, Laura began asking the neighbor over. He was a single 35-year-old millionaire with plenty of time on his hands. Dad was well aware of the arrangement and just happy Laura had the help that she needed. A man like me would have been concerned about the possibilities, but Dad trusted Laura completely. This was his mistake. He took off early one day and came home to find Laura cuddled up with a neighbor on the patio. The cowardly neighbor took off and left Laura alone to answer Dad's questions, and this is when the truth came out. When pressed on the matter, Laura admitted she and the neighbor had been having an affair since soon after they moved into the house, and Dad was obviously crushed by this news. But even worse, the tramp tried to blame Dad for the affair. She said that she had become lonely without him around, and the neighbor gave her the attention that she needed. Ultimately, her scheme didn't work as planned and Dad moved out. An arrangement would be made where she would be allowed to live in the lake house until the divorce was final, at which point it would be sold. Laura pretended that this didn't bother her, but as the time grew closer, she tried to lure Dad back into her clutches. On one occasion, she managed to get Dad over for a meal, at which point she got him drunk and seduced him into bed. For a short period of time, it looked like he changed his mind. Fortunately, me and my sister were able to bring him back to reality and he regained his senses. She wasn't done there, though. She even contacted some of us and asked us to change our dad's mind. We quickly shot her down. It was just a month until the hearing when a terrible accident would occur, though, or so we thought. I was headed out the door one morning when a nightmare came to life. My phone rang and my sister was on the other side. Through this storm of tears and sobs, I learned that my father was dead. Our uncle had found his body in his townhouse. It appeared that he had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It was hard to believe, but the cops were certain. I thought back to a discussion that we had a few weeks before. In hindsight, his demeanor was very downcast. He talked about how much of a failure he felt and how he wished that it could all just be over. At the time, I assumed that he meant that he was eager for the divorce to be over, but in light of his actions, I was left to rethink that. I told the police about this talk, and I think it may have been my words that motivated them to rule that he had taken his own life. The way it happened made little difference at the end of the day. My dad was dead, and I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. I was being eaten alive with grief. Losing both of my parents so close together was overwhelming. It was only when Laura began acting weird that I started to question the official record. Dad had been dead for more than a month before Laura called me. Considering his death, the divorce proceedings had ceased. She was still living in the lake house and was legally considered Dad's widow now. I'd forgotten all about her, to be honest. She had not been to the funeral or contacted anyone in the family. It was like she didn't exist. When I pressed her on her absence, she said that she assumed none of the family wanted her there. And while that's true, I can't imagine any wife who wouldn't at least show up briefly to bid her husband goodbye. And from there, I was forced to endure a 20-minute speech on how she was given no choice but to grieve the loss all alone. I asked about the neighbor, but she pretended not to hear me. And by now, I'd long grown sick of listening and just said goodbye. And now, I no longer had any excuse to speak to her and tried to put her out of my mind. Unfortunately, something she said has stuck with me and I really can't get past it. In the process of our phone call, Laura seemed to insist that Dad talked about taking his life often. I'd been raised by the man, and I never once heard him bring up that subject. We talked about death, of course, especially when Mom died, but I always got the impression that he looked down on it. I'd only accepted the police's verdict because of that final conversation. Although he never actually said the word, it made sense to me at the time. Her repeating this supposed fact rubbed me the wrong way, though. No one had ever questioned the cause of death. Why was she pushing it so hard? If she was trying to prevent any suspicion, she was doing a terrible job, and this would be the spark that set the fire in my head. From that point, I made it my goal to either remove any bit of doubt that I had or prove Laura had murdered him. The next year would lead me down the path of Laura's dark life, and I now have everything I need to reopen this investigation, if not prove her guilt outright. And this is just some of what I found. So let's start with Laura's early days. She'd grown up without a father and was raised by an alcoholic mother. The mother did her best to land herself a rich husband to take care of her and her young daughter, and this never panned out. Fresh out of high school, Laura took a job dancing at an adult club. Like many before her, she had taken the job to pay her way through college. Also, like many others, the fast-moving lifestyle of drink and drugs took its toll and she flunked out. And now she had no choice but to make the best of her new life. By all accounts, she had taken up the baton from her mother and dated many wealthy men but had similar results. And that was until she met the man who became her first husband. He swooped in and saved her from her life of debauchery. All was well in paradise for a while, but when her husband lost his life in a car accident, she was left widowed and lonely. There were a few who questioned the timing, however. Their friends knew that he had been talking divorce and she was well aware of it. The timing of his death left many suspicious. And despite the concerns of a few, the police had no reason to question the cause of death. It was ruled an accident and Laura moved on to another man almost overnight. After she spent all of her husband's money on one-night stands and partying, she went on the hunt for a new sugar daddy. And that's how she met my dad. He was making good money at the time, but obviously had the potential to make more. He was lonely, and she knew it. Dad moved her in soon after they met and began buying her all kinds of expensive presents. He'd already started taking extra work by the time I heard about the wedding. He said he was doing it to pay for the wedding, but when they went to buy the lake house, it was clear what was going on. I was understandably concerned that he may be stretching himself too thin, but it was so nice to see him happy that I just couldn't really push back on this. My suspicions were cemented when I discovered Laura had moved the neighbor in just a few months prior to Dad's death. This made zero sense in light of the arrangement her and her dad had made. If she knew the house was just months away from being put up for sale, why would she move her lover in? Wouldn't it make more sense to move in with him? His house is far from a dump. She had to have known that the sale was never going to happen. And with Dad dead, she would get everything from his estate, including the house, and get to keep her lover. The problem would be proving all of this, though. And that's what I'm working on at the present. I have a private detective chasing down and confirming all of these leads. And if he comes to the same conclusion that I have, my sister and I are going to the police and demand that they reopen the case. I realize what I've presented to all of you here is really circumstantial, but I can assure you that there is much more information, and much of it very damning. I choose not to include it here for the sake of brevity and to ensure Laura is kept guessing if she just so happens to listen to the channel. I promise I wouldn't even gone to the lengths that I have if I wasn't confident in my suspicions. The detectives have notified me that this investigation is winding down and things don't look good for Laura. I will admit that I have mixed feelings about the whole thing, but my dad deserves justice. Once I've taken the file to the police and they let me know their decision, I will post and try to give you guys an update. Just pray the law sees the truth and this murdering witch gets the punishment she deserves. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, or send it over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, always carve the soap.